All right, so we're gonna talk about the reactions of the church to Constantine, because they're as divided as we are to Constantine. The first reaction is what we can call imperialistic Christianity. And the main guy here is Eusebius of Caesarea. We'll say Eusebius. Well, yeah. Eusebius of Caesarea. Haken, your book, describes him as the father of church history because of his invaluable work on the history of church up to this day. This is not just some random dude. Eusebius was very important to the church. And this is what he said about Constantine. Looking westward or eastward, looking over the whole earth, and even looking at heaven, always and everywhere I see blessed Constantine leading the same empire. So he's very pro-Constantine, right? This approach was to see everything that was happening with Constantine, not everything, but the good things that were happening with Constantine as part of God's plan for the church. And of course, we could see that, right? Because of the very seemingly connection they had to the exodus of the Israelites, right? They were leaving the slavery of being persecuted and were given a great victory in somewhat of a miraculous military conquest of Constantine over Maxentius. So they began to see this thing. And after years of persecution, this would feel like a victory that the church had. And the church even began to, Constantine began to plunder the pagan temples. And what happened as Israel was leaving Egypt? You remember?
They took
gold. And yeah. Yahweh said to them, and then in this way, you will plunder the Egyptians. So, they would have seen this. It'd be very easy to see how they would have been like, man, this seems to be what God is doing. And it very well could have been what God was doing. Eusebius himself even saw persecution firsthand and escaped it a few times. Many of his friends were persecution. And this for the Christians, not Eusebius, but for some Christians, they were so enamored with Constantine that they even made offerings to Constantine because of the effect that he had upon the church. So that's what's so tragically ironic about it. And listen, we cannot be quick to judge, right? We don't know. We have to. I mean, we are going to judge what they did. But what I'm saying is we should not feel superior to some of these Christians like we would to the Israelites or things like that. We have to try to understand why they did things while also condemning the tragic irony of it, that what Christians were refusing to do and being killed for many years before, Christians were now willingly doing to an emperor. Eusebius was simply expressing the common feeling among Christians for whom the advent of Constantine and of the peace he brought about was the final triumph of Christianity over its enemies. Those Christians were not able to express their opinions with Eusebius' elegance and erudition, but they were the ones who, step by step, shaped the church in the years to come. Eusebius was the mouthpiece of the thousands of Christians who, like him, were overawed by God's mercy in finally delivering the church from persecution. So that's imperialistic. Eusebius would be a mouthpiece for that. The second reaction is, there's two categories to it. They're not very much in a favor of Constantine, but we'll look at them separately. Monasticism. The monks. Okay? There were those who bemoaned what they saw as the low level to which the Christian life had descended. So with the influx of many different converts, how easy it was now to be a Christian, it does not seem to be like we are taking up our cross and following Christ People are becoming baptized who don't know anything about the faith. You have these Christians who are making pagan offerings. This is not good. The narrow gate of which Jesus had spoken had become so wide that countless multitudes were hurrying through it, many seeming to do so only in pursuit of privilege and position, without caring to delve too deeply into the meaning of Christian baptism and life under the cross. Bishops competed with one another over prestigious positions. So this is where you see bishops. They had to institute a law that a bishop, when he became the bishop of a city, could not be a bishop anywhere else. Because bishops would take bishoprics at certain cities and then try to leverage those jobs into more prestigious positions. It's tragic, right? Because that is not the calling of a pastor. So it made that law that you couldn't leave. If you became a bishop of a city, you could not leave that city and be a bishop somewhere else, because they were leveraging these to privilege and position. The rich and powerful seemed to dominate the life of the church. The tares were growing so rapidly that they threatened to choke out the wheat. So, with the backdrop of persecution and faithfulness, it's easy to see how some believers thought that struggle was integral to the life of the Christian. And the struggle that was brought to the life of the Christians in previous times were brought on by the Roman Empire. And now that the Roman Empire wasn't going to do it, maybe it was upon the Christian to make their lives difficult so that they could remain faithful to God. It began, as Constantine made Christianity very popular, it began to be a position of people there would be more and more Christians, so it would make sense for you to become a Christian, for more and more people to like you. So that's what they would seek to be a part of the church simply as a status in society now, because it was becoming commonplace. You were slowly between Constantine to Theodosius, it became more and more Christianized. So to be a pagan was to be a Christian in the time of the pagans. So people were becoming more and more Christianized and not actually understanding or believing in Christ, but taking baptism and not really knowing what was happening. Yeah. And then leaders were becoming Christians because they had a big following of people behind them. Yeah. So more and more. This was not instant. This was a process. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. So what were these people to do? They said, you know what? Let's move to the desert. The desert became a place of decadence to those who were seeking to affirm their faith in Christ through struggle, like the early church did when they were being persecuted. Many found an answer in the monastic life, to flee from human society, to leave everything behind, so they'd sell all their possessions, to dominate the body and its passions. They would many times be unmarried. They would many times only eat food that was necessary. They would only have things that were extremely necessary. Many of them lived. There were two kinds of monastics. There were those who would be alone. They would seek solitude. And then there was those who would live in community with others, and both have fathers and fantastic merit to them. To dominate the body and its passions, which give way to temptation. Thus, at the very time when churches in large cities were flooded by thousands demanding baptism, there was a veritable exodus of other thousands who sought beatitude in solitude. So, as many were flooding into the churches that Constantine was building, many were leaving the cities, going to the desert to try to find God in the desert. Where did this begin? We don't know who was the first monk, or who did this the first. Jerome will say that Paulus, not Paul, Paulus the monk was the first monk. But then in the same work, he will mention that Paulus joined other people who were in the wilderness. So then it's like, well, who was first? Chicken before the egg or egg before the chicken. But then Athanasius will write about St. Anthony, right, who was a monk, and he will say that he was one of the first. We don't know who the first one was, but the idea of having a more dedicated position, a more dedicated life to God, was not a new idea, right? Paul says, he teaches that if you are able, you should take singleness, right? So that you might be more dedicated to the kingdom, right? The widows would either could get remarried or remain single, and the church was supported by many widows who did a lot of the work and ministry of the church. Those who would remain virgins for the sake of the church were seen as somewhat of a higher calling, and then the martyrs, because they gave their life, were seen as the life of a martyr was an honorable, higher calling to Christianity. So the idea of there being some sort of higher calling to Christianity that required a deeper dedication to God that would do away with the joys of the world was not a new idea, and monasticism brought that in and used it. Of course, Gnosticism could have been somewhat of an influence of it, and Greek philosophy. Stoic doctrine, very widespread at the time, held that passions are the great enemy of true wisdom, and that the wise devote themselves to the perfecting of their souls and the subjugation of their passions. So this was a Stoic idea, too. So they were just utilizing that into Christianity. And I'm not going to condemn it, right? It's hard. It's hard to talk about this idea very negatively when you have men like Athanasius, men like Augustine, the Cappadocians, Basil of Caesarea being one of the Cappadocians, who we owe, as a church, we owe these men great debt of thankfulness because of their faithfulness to God and their teachings. And they were not monks, but they desired to be monks, actually, and were made bishops before they could become monks. But they saw the monks as a very a good calling in life, and one that they appreciated very deeply. The appeal to it is that they desired to study deeply and to write and to know the truth of God. So they decided to make their life dedicated to that pursuit. Now, so where it goes wrong is when we begin to blur the line between what makes someone a Christian and what is a calling that a Christian can have. So are all Christians called to be monks? I hope not. I am not called to be a monk, right? Are all Christians called to be unmarried? No, I hope not. I am married, okay? So, but does God have that calling for some? Yeah, Paul says it. Paul says, I am like this, right? And certainly the life of the monk in its earlier inceptions were very valuable to the church, and the writings were very valuable to the church. Now, there are problems, of course, and we'll talk about some of the problems, aside from just the idea of it being an elevated holiness. And when I say that it's an idea of elevated holiness, that's what they saw. I'm just telling you what they saw. I don't think that's the elevated level of holiness for your life is you doing what God calls you to do. That's what you should do. You should not, if God does not call you to something, you should not do it. Yeah. So there's not this standard, right? You see this in the life of Luther. He became a monk because he thought that it was he would become closer to God. Was that a good idea? That's a hard answer, right? Because it was through becoming a monk that he was able to study the scriptures very clearly. And it was through studying the scriptures very clearly that he saw that there were major problems with the church. And it's through seeing major problems with the church that he was put in a position where people would listen to him, and then he was able to teach what he learned when he was a monk, right? So then he would become he would be a monk for most of his life, but he would be a professor and teaching as well. So, yeah, many of the monks were still affiliated with the church in some way, where the church would come to them and offer them communion on the same Sundays. And they also saw it as their job to, when people would come to them, they would teach them. So they were somewhat like teachers. Now, Basil of Caesarea saw a major problem with solitude, being a monk in solitude. So he said that we ought to be monk. If you're going to be a monk, you should be one in community, so that you can love each other. We'll talk about that actually when we get to Basil. So you have to address their motives, right? In some ways, you guys right now are pursuing some sort of a monastic. You've dedicated a year to your life to the continual study of the Word, right? So that you might be serving the church. So that's the idea, right? Now, could someone do that incorrectly, and could you feel like, well, because I'm doing this, I'm a better Christian, or should you just view this as what God has for you right now? And when we go away to school, although we don't take it, our courses are not nearly as rigorous as what you guys are going through. You do 4 years of work that we do in America in 1 year. You're doing 4 years in 1 year. So you guys are really taking on a rigorous study. But when we go to Bible school to train to be a pastor, we'll go away for 4 years to a school, and study for 4 years, and get the education that you guys are getting right now. That also can be looked at as a time of solitude and study and in preparation for being a servant of God. And these men just saw it as my task is to write and to learn and to study. And their motives were never always perfect, right? And for the case that you're saying about, we run into those kinds of issues too, where people say, I love Christ, but I don't love the church, and it is a very deep misunderstanding of what the Scripture says to try to just be in solitude without any sort of reason for it, right? Even Paul's instruction to married couples to abstain from sexual relationship for a time of prayer, right? Don't do that unless you are doing it for some sort of time of prayer, he says, right? So even there is a biblical idea or fasting is also a biblical idea of subjugating your fleshly desires and your fleshly needs for the purpose of a heightened awareness of God and of the things of God. So, but it's easy to go over the line with these things, right? It's very easy to move past them and to say, oh man, that guy, he sold everything and became what a great Christian, right? Well, if he did it because God wanted him to, yes. If he did it but he did it for another reason other than what God wanted him to do, he's actually a fool. The neutral position in church history. I would say that the guys we're talking about are the neutral position. Guys who saw a great value and merit in the monastic life, but did not see it as the end-all, be-all of Christianity. When they were, Augustine, when he was seeking to be in a communal monastic living, when he was asked or told more or less, the funny theme that we're going to see actually coming up is that none of these men wanted to be bishops, and then the town told them they had to be, and then they took it. So like Augustine was just passing through Hippo on his way, and he was actually meeting with a friend to try to convince his friend to come with him to go live in solitude with the rest of the people that were with him. And the bishop of Hippo wanted Augustine, he was getting older, he wanted Augustine to replace him. So he got the people to. But when they were desiring to be monastic, and they felt another calling from God come into their life, they gave up what they thought was going to be good and right, and they said, this must be what God's calling for my life is to be a bishop. So they were not dead set on what they thought was right. They were willing to be moved by the Spirit to however God wanted them to be moved. Yep. And certainly there were those who saw the antinomian nature of the imperial church and said, we need to institute more structure. Yeah. And they were not that's where they blurred the lines between what God has revealed as being of first importance, which is the gospel, with how mankind reacts with the gospel. What I'm saying is that a Christian should be able to exist in obedience to God as a bishop, as a layperson, as a monk, as a member of government, as all of these different situations, right? In the context we're talking about. Do it faithfully because God calls us all to different sorts of things, right? So there's not like, oh, these are the better Christians and these are the lesser Christians and that's where it gets into, and that's not a helpful idea at all. Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, they weren't afraid of Constantine, but I mean, I want you to imagine that you're a pastor of a church and you've been a pastor of a church for a few years, and then, all of a sudden you have, over the course of a few months, you have let's say 60 people come to join your church, and it's mostly you, and maybe you have another guy with you. What are you going to do?
Was there any membership process back then?
There was. But how could you possibly? So they were torn between being excited about what God was doing in their church, and also trying to make sure that they were only bringing in those who were truly Christian. And my point is that I'm ready to extend them grace in how to handle persecution correctly with the lapsed, and then also how to handle the incursion of the imperial changes that were happening with the church. These are not easy. These were not easy problems that they were trying to solve. Especially when you have men on both sides of it who were esteemed by the church. It would be hard to try to figure out the right position or the right application of it. Okay. So these monks, they would suppress physical passions in the hope of bringing about spiritual vitality, marriage, food, comforts, and then the ones who were isolated, fellowship. Proponents. So the first, one of the major proponents, one of the famous ones, is Paul or Paulos, written by Jerome. He wrote a story about Jerome wrote about Paulos, and Jerome's letter on Paulos, or his book on Paulos, is probably legendary. It's not actually fully real, but it was maybe based on a real person. And he moved he fled persecution into the Egyptian desert, stayed there the rest of his life, devoting himself to prayer, solitude, and holy living. The other major one is a guy named Anthony, written about by Athanasius. Now, Anthony most assuredly was a real person, and Athanasius presents him to be a real person. He was an Egyptian. His parents were very wealthy, and they left him in a state that he could live off of for the rest of his life. So his inheritance, when they died, he could just live off of it the rest of his life. And then he heard a sermon on the rich young ruler, give away all that you have and follow me. And so he decided to do that. And when he was tempted with physical passion, he added to himself more discipline. And people were following him into the lifestyle that he was living. And as they would come to him, he would teach them. But then he began to move farther and farther into the desert to pursue a life of solitude. And they would keep following him. And it was at one point that he tried to come when there was isolated about a persecution coming about. He tried to give himself away in persecution, but the emperor didn't want to persecute someone who looked so disheveled. So they didn't think that would be very honorable at all. During the Arian controversy, so when we get to the Arian controversy, he was so revered among the Christians for his teachings and his prayers that the Arians tried to claim that he was an Arian, right? And Athanasius, being the second most proponent for Nicene Christianity, was going to correct that idea. And he actually brought Anthony to one of the synods one of the meetings to appear before them in the Council of Alexandria. And this is where it is recorded that Anthony confounded the Arians with his explanation of Nicene orthodoxy. So that the Son of God is deity, right? And Anthony would die in 356, having only one possession, a cloak that he sent to Athanasius. The next one is a man named Pacomius. And Pacomius decided to try to explore the differences of monastic living, and this is where we come up with communal monasticism. He probably wasn't the first one to do this, but he's one of the earliest. He still sought the solitude of the world, but he wanted to live as a Cenobite instead of an anchorite. So anchorites were I'll write these down. Anchorite and Cenobite. These are isolated monks. These are communal. So they wanted to be a Cenobite monk. He wasn't the founder, but he was a major proponent. He was born in 286 to pagan parents. He was conscripted into the army, and it was in the army when a group of Christians came to him to console him, as he was not happy about being in the army. And when he saw this and was ministered to, he vowed to do the same thing with his life, minister to those who were hurting, if he ever made it out of the military. And unexpectedly, he was dispatched from the military, and he got baptized and decided to move into the desert with the help of an old anchorite himself. And then after a few years, he decided to move farther into the wilderness with his brother, whose name was John. And it was at that time that he remembered his vow that he had made, and he wanted to continue to live as a monk, but to be able to help people who were hurting. So he decided to form a communal monk monasticism. And it didn't work out the first time, because he brought all these people out and just expected them to pull their weight around the monastery, and they were taking advantage of him. So he did it again. He told them they had to leave. He did it again, but then he gave orders for what people were to do to help make the monastery work. And so he began to write things that were prescriptions for how you ought to run a monastery. And this is what made communal monasticism begin to thrive. What was required of those who would move out to be with Pacomius was daily devotion and work. And together they all made a meager living to support their lifestyle and the community. And another thing that he instituted when he was in charge was when he died, he appointed another monk to take his place as the leader of the monastery, or you could call them the abbot of the monastery. And this was a custom that would continue on for many years, that the abbot or the leader of the monastery, when he was getting close to death, he would say that this man is going to be the one who replaces me. The priests would come to the monasteries to give communion. Pacomius' sister, whose name was Mary, decided that this is a good idea to institute for women. So they would bring widows and women who were not going to be married, and they would bring them into a community living as well to devote themselves to the service of the church, to devote themselves to the study of the Word and to holy living. And unfortunately, for the benefits of what happened with Mary, there were many different problems. So the women who served as deaconesses and the widows and those who were serving in the church began to leave the churches and go to what would be known as the nunneries, right? And this left a hole in the church, the service of the church. So there's benefits and negatives to it as well. And in some cases, women outnumbered the men in monastic living. And this type of life took off like wildfire. There were people who were very interested in it. And there were even people showing up to become part of monasteries that had not yet been baptized, had not yet been a catechumen. They weren't even Christian yet, but they wanted the life of being in solitude. So they would obviously teach them and baptize them and bring them in. And it's hard to underestimate the amount of influence the lifestyle benefited the church. Athanasius was benefited by the monastic lifestyle, Jerome, Basil the Cappadocians, and Augustine. And of course, with such an extreme lifestyle, right, it tends to attract some very extreme personalities. And this is where we get the idea of extreme monastic living, where people would, hurt themselves as part of their discipline to God. This is where we have fanatic monasticism, where people were at war in some ways with the church. We see this with the zealots, with the Pharisees, the zealot side of things, that they were willing to do battle. So, you had this offshoot of monasticism that became very fanatical and extreme, but that does not represent the whole picture. It's just the far extreme side of it. Conclusion. In all of this, there was a common thread: the conviction that the ideal Christian life was one of personal poverty and sharing of goods. This is what it was like in the early church. The earlier practice of Christian communities in general of sharing goods among its members now became the hallmark of monasticism, communal monasticism, something expected of monks and nuns, but not of the rest of the church. So that's an unfortunate error. So the good ideas of sharing all in common and denying your flesh, your sinful flesh, began to be hallmarks of only the monks and not of the normal church. So the idea of sharing your goods with your Christian friends or your Christian brothers and sisters, if you were not a monk, you would say, well, that's not for me. That's not a commandment for me. So that's an unfortunate schism that occurred. Now that almost all of the population had become Christian, most were excused from such sharing, while monastics continued that earlier tradition. This is where they continued in the faith, right? Those arose a distinction between two levels of Christians, which would mark most of the history of the church, a distinction reinforced by the vows of celibacy and obedience that only monastics took. So this is an unfortunate thing that happened, right? In the time of Luther, women were not even allowed to go into the monasteries, right? They were not. What's interesting is I have a friend. There are a couple in our church, actually, a family in our church, and they just moved to Michigan, and they bought a house that used to be a nunnery. They in the back of their house by their kitchen, there's a door that was a side door that goes goes directly into the basement. And he told me that what that was for men to be able to go into the building to fix something that was wrong with the building or whatever, without seeing the nuns, and without the nuns seeing them, because of this distinct living that they had. Now this is this was a Catholic nunnery, right? This is this is not what we're talking. This early idea of nunnery, but that was where that came from. Was a distinction between the sexes. Another reaction, which was anti-Constantine, is what we call Donatism, which was a heresy, actually. And what the Donatists believed was that the church was over because of the Roman incursion, and that it was time to start a new church. So that's what the Donatists thought. Since the rise of Constantine, there were some who thought that the church was beyond saving and decided to separate from the church. There were several groups, but Donatism was the most prevalent group. And one of the things that they continued struggling with, that the rise of Constantine was just kind of the breaking point, was the controversy of the lapsed, right? So the Donatists really struggled with the church receiving back the lapsed. So then this comes in as another sort of, the church is not as pure as what we want it to be, and it was the breaking point, right? So this is a large portion of North Africa. Carthage is where the Donatism began. And of course, we know that in Carthage, there was very violent persecution, and there were many who had lapsed, and then there was a great debate over all of this, is what we've already talked about. During one of the major persecutions, the bishop left, not Cyprian, and then, this is another time, and when he left, when he came back, the Donatists appointed a bishop that they agreed with, and then those who were thinking we should receive the lapsed back put one that they thought that they should have as their bishop. So there were two bishops of Carthage at this time, appointed by the two different factions, and Majornus was the one that was named by the rigorists, the Donatists. They weren't called Donatists, yes, because then they appointed a man named Donatus to be their bishop. And he came in as the bishop. And then what happened was, you have two bishops of Carthage, right? You have Cecilian and Donatus. And the Donatists were very much against the lapsed, and the Cecilianists were very much received them back in grace. Constantine comes in and says that he doesn't like, Constantine was never a fan of the church being divided on things because he saw it as a weakness in his empire. So Constantine comes in and he says, Cecilian is the true bishop. And that was very difficult for the Donatists to accept. Even though we would agree with the Cecilian idea, right, of even if you would agree with that, the idea of the emperor of the nation coming in and ordering the leader of the church to do something was a precedent that was not a good precedent to be set, and one that would have some pretty bad implications, as we will see with Athanasius. So Donatists would have to be exiled from Carthage, and this is where the Donatist schism occurred. And it was around 340 that the Donatists became very radicalized and even began to attack certain members. They were convinced that there was no death more glorious than that of the martyrs, and that now that persecution in the old style had ended, those who died in battle against the perverters of the faith were also martyrs. So that's what the Donatists thought. So they became very radicalized in that. And the Donatists lasted until the 7th century, actually, this idea. In conclusion, Donatism, particularly its radical branch, they were called the Circumcellians. The radical side of Donatism was called the Circumcellians, because it started in the city of Circumcellion, was a response to the new conditions brought by the conversion of Constantine. While some Christians received the new order with open arms and others withdrew to the desert, the Donatists simply broke with the church that had now become an ally of the empire. Okay, so let me ask you, which group do you want to be a part of? There were There's a fourth group. You're like, thank you. And these are the kinds, this fourth group are where we would put the men like Augustine and Athanasius and Jerome and the Cappadocians. Though those men saw good things in imperialism, good things in monasticism, and even good things in Donatism, right? They morally rigorous, being holy before God, but they said we should not be radicalized in any of these ways, right? We should simply realize that the kingdom of God is not an earthly kingdom, it's a heavenly kingdom. And can we use the earthly kingdom to forward the kingdom of God? Yes. But what we can do is we can honor the empire, but understand ourselves to be citizens of heaven and conduct ourselves in a way that is honoring to the scriptures and continue to preach the gospel and plant churches. And these are the men who we refer to as the church fathers, who through this time decided to keep the church pure as much as they can, fighting heresy while remaining within the bounds of the empire, and not trying to fit into any of these radicalized positions, especially radical monasticism. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah.
So the Donatists didn't allow the people that lapsed back into the church, but did they also have a lot of other heretical teachings?
Just that they were now the new church, and another problem that the Donatists had were not only would they not allow you back into the church if you were lapsed, if you were baptized by someone who had lapsed, or you were or anything, that baptism does not count. So that was also a radicalized idea, right? And Augustine argues against that in his letter against his book against the Donatists, and says that Christians should not fear their whole life, hoping that the bishop who baptized them stays faithful to the truth. And you can also tie that to marriage. So the first battle that these church fathers are going to fight to preserve the church. So I think I said earlier in the class that the early church, the big battle that they fought was staying pure and moving through persecution. Okay? And the church post-Constantine was looking for a fight, to fight for the Lord, right? What can we do to keep the church pure? And what they were no longer having in persecution, they now had in heresy. And the first battle that the church fathers would have to take on to preserve the church was going to be the Arian controversy. Arianism.